and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. I'm here at this year's Khazanah Megatrends Forum with the headliner of the event, the keynote speaker, Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter, OBE. He's an Emeritus Professor of Statistics in the Center for Mathematical Sciences at Cambridge University, and his new book is The Art of Uncertainty: How to Navigate Chance, Ignorance, Risk and Luck. And there's lots to talk about today. Professor, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you.
So your keynote address this morning at the KMF 2025 was really interesting. You titled it Rising to the Challenge of an Age of Uncertainty. And in it, you defined uncertainty as the conscious awareness of ignorance,
yes,
which is really quite interesting. And I'm curious to know, when we think about an age of uncertainty, what is it that you're seeing as the defining features of this age? Why do you say this is an age of uncertainty?
Oh, there's so many features. We've been through other periods, I think, of deep uncertainty and anxiety over the last 100 years. The 1930s, the rise of militarism, and there's a lot of social and economic and political upheaval. And then the 50s and 60s, there was a fear of nuclear war, so there's a political and technological anxieties. But now we've got the full pack of cards. We've got
Monty.
Political, economic, we've got social, technological, environmental, health anxieties that are all combining. So yeah, it's an extraordinary time, and that's why the topic of the meeting, I think, is so very appropriate.
Yes. So in your book or in your writings, you've talked about the separate concepts of risk, of chance, of ignorance, of luck. Yeah. And I'm just wondering, do we need to distinguish between the two? How do we think about all of them?
I kind of think they're all aspects of uncertainty. So I don't really distinguish between risk and uncertainty. People use risk, usually because it means that something bad might happen.
Yeah.
And but it's all to do with just not knowing. That's why I like this definition as the conscious awareness of ignorance. It's what you don't know. And you might not know about the future, and actually you don't know really what's going on at the moment, and you don't know what happened in the past. We live a life of almost complete ignorance, and that's part of being human. And definitely part of being human is not knowing what's going to happen in the future. I always ask audiences, do you like uncertainty? And they say, oh, no, no, no. And I say, really? So, when you're watching a series on television, you watch the last episode immediately to find what happens. If there's a sporting match you've missed, you want to know the result before you watch the game. And then the question I always ask is, if I could tell you, would you want to know when you were going to die? And usually a few do, the real planners, the ones who would like to have everything sorted out. But most people don't. And so I think what that illustrates is that as humans, we live in an absolute world of uncertainty, and we like it. Right. It's part of being human. Imagine living a life where you knew exactly what was going to happen tomorrow. It'd be like being in the worst kind of prison.
I love that.
So we are creatures of uncertainty. We actually, I think, enjoy it. It's what makes us human. And so that's why but I do like to try to take it apart, which is what I was trying to do in the book, in all these different ways. And I think chance, risk, luck, ignorance, they're all just parts of being uncertain.
So let's embrace the uncertainty, but we should unpack it. Now, you have argued that it is usually better to express uncertainty through numbers, so using numerical evidence,
as
opposed to using words.
If possible, because it's right in daily life. I can say, well, this may happen, and I could go somewhere tomorrow, and this might happen, and that's fine in just our daily chatting to each other. But if we're doing something important, if we're making, thinking about finances, or if we're thinking in terms of sort of more sort of social, societal world about what might be the threats in the future to society, we need to be much more, I think, quantitative. It doesn't have to be exact. It's not to 3 decimal places, 0.1, the chance is 0.132. No, that's nonsense. But just rough magnitudes. And so, for example, because of the mistakes people have made in the past about for example, intelligence work of using words instead of numbers. Now, in good intelligence services, make sure there's a correspondence between the two. So if you're in the UK intelligence services, MI5 for internal, MI6 for external, if you use the word unlikely, you have to mean between 25 and 35% probability. And similarly, so that's what there's a correspondence between the words and the numbers. So that means that when people use the word unlikely, they're all talking about the same thing, rather than just their own interpretation of unlikely. And this is incredibly important, I think.
I think there's this pervasive thinking that using words is better because it's less intimidating. Yeah. How do you respond?
But I think that you need everything. And so when I talk about communicating uncertainty, there's not a single best way to do it. And normally if I was doing that, I would use words at the top level, just to give the gist, to give the feeling of it. Oh yeah, this is quite a likely thing to, an unlikely or unlikely thing to happen. But then I would want to reinforce that by saying what I meant by likely, and trying to use some numbers to give an idea of where it stands in the sort of list of things that is this really, a very extreme event, or is it actually pretty well very plausible?
Do you think the public is afraid of numbers when we give a definitive number to something?
Oh, and I think you should be careful about giving definitive numbers because people, people find numbers difficult. I think everyone does, and they tend to think, like it's some cold, hard. It must be a fact.
It must be
if it's a number.
Yes.
No. I always think of numbers are actually quite soft, fluffy things. In fact, that you need to treat quite gently. And to realise that they don't speak for themselves. They are not cold hard facts. We have to interpret them. We have to give them meaning. We have to give them a context. Is this a big number, for example? That's the first answer, where first question to ask when someone gives you a number. You say, well, is this really big? If someone's going to spend so many million, ringgits or dollars or something in the whole, it sounds a lot. But then if you realise it's going over the whole country, it's almost nothing for each person. And so you have to ask, is this a big number? I know I can make any number look big or small, depending on how I tell the story.
Yeah.
So we can be really manipulated by people's use of numbers. We have to be very careful because they can sound so persuasive.
I want to unpack that a little bit more. The communication of uncertainty. So when governments and media, journalists like myself, trying to communicate uncertainty, often we fall back on words because we think, that's the most easily understood. Yeah. How would you caution us to think about that?
I think again at a top level, at the gist, it's fine to use words, but you want to make sure those words are sort of calibrated. So that, if you are saying that something, well, this is unlikely to happen, you really mean that there's a reasonably small chance of that occurring. But I think that, and it is difficult in media, especially in a short news story, to give a feeling of how big those things actually are. In COVID, audiences became much more willing to accept numbers. They wanted to see them. And the media became much better at communicating them, using graphs and so on, all the sort of things that they wouldn't normally want to do, they started doing because people realized they wanted to know about trends in what was happening in the pandemic. Yes. They wanted to know about vaccine effectiveness and all that kind of stuff. And so suddenly the media had to learn quite quickly, I think, how to communicate numbers in a trustworthy way. And on the whole, they were successful. Yeah.
I think the pandemic really made us all public health experts.
Exactly.
And also statisticians.
Yeah.
Maybe even.
And there were some very good ones. That was when Twitter actually worked properly. And there were lots of people, including myself, as the data was coming out, doing their own analyses, putting them up. It was a really exciting time. Right. And I wouldn't, you can't really call them amateurs because they were actually doing some very good analyses, but it was just being done at home. It wasn't their complete job.
So talk to me about that. Let's revisit the COVID-19 pandemic. You were very busy during that period because, of course, you had a lot of communicating to do about risk, about uncertainty. Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about the lessons that we should probably think about, public communicators, public health communicators specifically, in presenting uncertainty, especially during a fast fast-moving crisis like the
Yeah,
pandemic?
I think, I mean, I do a lot of work with the media, and as I said, the media during the pandemic really improved, because when they started off, I was being asked, well, what will happen? Or who's to blame?
Look in your crystal ball.
Yeah, exactly. What should we do? And I said, I'm not going to answer that. It's not my job, and I couldn't tell you anyway. I'm just going to say what the situation is at the moment and maybe some possible futures of what might occur. But I was even unwilling to do that very much. I wanted just to explain things. And after a while, I felt the media learnt, partly because of the audience response. They realized that people did just want an explanation. They didn't want an argument, because the media love an argument. They want to have someone, what's going to happen, and then somebody else thinks something else is going to happen. What should we do, and who's to blame? They realized that in that situation, the public actually wanted an explanation. They wanted help. And so I found a real strong role in that, and the media responded to it very well. I felt.
Could you give me an example?
Well, I don't know. I suppose, well, for example, on vaccines, there was an argument about who should get them and when and things like that, and then afterwards about the risks associated with them. And people, they would want to ask me, well, what should be done, and who's to blame? Why are we doing this? And I said, I'm not going to do that. I will explain about what vaccine effectiveness means, and there could be side effects, and trying to explain that. Well, actually, of course, I was actually trying to counter what I thought was a really bad public health message that was coming from some people in the government that just said vaccines are safe and effective and you should take them. And I thought this was really untrustworthy, because vaccines are not completely safe and they're not completely effective. They're effective enough and safe enough to give to some people in some circumstances. That's the truth. And so, but if you just say vaccines are safe and effective, the moment that someone has a vaccine and then gets COVID or gets ill because of COVID, which can happen, or they get a vaccine and get a side effect, and they think, well, suddenly they realize that that message was not trustworthy. They thought, when they heard vaccines are safe and effective, that they were completely safe and they're completely effective, and that was not true. So I think what that shows is that, for some, the public are not stupid, and yet I think a lot of public health messaging can treat the public as if they're children. Yeah. They're just children. They have to just give a simple message and repeat it a lot. A lot of people would still think that, I think, and I got quite angry about that.
Well, a lot of people do still think that, especially when you think about the aftermath of the pandemic and the kind of rise of the anti-vaxxer.
Yeah.
And a lot of the conversation has been, well, don't engage them even in public, in debate or conversation, because there's no changing their mind. But I like this approach of giving them an explanation that will build trustworthiness.
Well, I think it's a really good issue, because there are some that you'll never change their mind. So there isn't any, for some there's no point engaging, but there is a group of people who are quite doubtful, and we've done research when we randomly allocated members of the public to two different messages. One was the standard, vaccines are safe and effective, and the other one was much more balanced and nuanced. It admitted about that it's not completely safe, not completely effective, there's some uncertainty and things like that. And what we found is actually completely intuitive. For people who already thought vaccines were a great thing, it made no difference what message they got. But for the people who are rather skeptical of vaccines, they trusted the balanced message a lot more, because for once they were hearing a message that they felt was engaging with their concerns. Right. Whereas if you just keep on repeating vaccines are safe and effective, that slightly skeptical group just feel they're not being listened to. And so what that means is, of course, if you just keep on hammering this simplistic message home, you're actively decreasing trust in the group you're trying to reach, who are the skeptical people. You're making it worse. And so I felt this was we did proper experiments, and it totally changed my mind about all of this. It really, I thought, wow. And then it sort of made sense. No, if you're going to try to engage with people, not the completely hard line, but the slightly skeptical people, you have to listen to them. First rule of communication, shut up and listen. Listen to their concerns.
Well, I think politicians have the hardest time with this idea of providing an explanation or admitting that something might not be black and white or 100%.
I know. I get... during COVID, I was quite rude about the political sort of announcements that were being made, because I felt they were completely overconfident. They were using numbers, as we described before, in order to impress people. I called it number theatre. Using numbers as a performance to impress people. They didn't understand what the numbers were. The numbers weren't right, but they didn't care. They were just using it this was a big number and it was used to impress people. And for a statistician, this is so annoying.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
But the argument is that they have to be seen as being decisive.
Well, this is one of the problems, and you know, at this conference I was complaining about this, is that you know, good, I think, trustworthy communicators can acknowledge uncertainty. Not only acknowledge uncertainty, but even more difficult for politicians, they can acknowledge provisionality. This is what we think at the moment, this is what we advise at the moment, but as we learn more, things will change, and our advice will change. And so good communicators, and there are examples of those in crises, can do that. They say, well, this is what we think, this is what we advise, but as we learn more, our advice will change. Politicians cannot do that. It's not in their language. It's not in their mindset to say, well, we're going to do this at the moment, but as we learn more, might do something different.
Right.
And yet they're always obsessed about being accused of doing a U-turn, which means they start on something and can't change, even though they know they're wrong.
Yes, well, the public is also to blame with that, because we don't like to see our leaders making these U-turns and
decisions. The point is that the trusted people in the UK, were very good, because they didn't say it was a U-turn. They said, we are adjusting our direction.
Okay.
Yes,
it's how you communicate.
That's it. They use the analogy of a ship, and we are adjusting our course.
Okay. So talk to me about provisionality.
Yeah.
When do you think decision makers should weigh this? So weigh uncertain evidence against precaution. I'm wondering, when do you act early on weak data versus waiting?
I think it's reasonably a precautionary. I don't think it should be a precautionary principle. It's reasonable to act when areas when you've got a lot of uncertainty, and again, precautionary behaviour as a provisional activity. Okay. So I knew in the UK, in the Food Standards Agency, had disaster after disaster. We had foot and mouth disease, we had mad cow disease, then they had scrapie in sheep, all this stuff, awful things where there was, concern about beef and lamb, whether it was safe to eat. And there was a lot of uncertainty. And the head of the agency, John Krebs, said at the time, well, there's still some uncertainty about this, but we're trying to find out about it, we're researching it. In the meantime, if you want to be on the safe side, don't eat lamb. They said, we don't think there's any harm for it, but you could be cautious if you want to. And then he said, our advice will change. We will come back to you later. So what is meaning that precautionary advice is reasonable, but only as a sort of stopgap until you know more. It's not as an absolute principle when you're in some uncertainty. What happened, of course, is that the prices went down and people started buying it again.
The cheap prices are too good to resist. Yeah. That speaks to me a level of humility in leadership.
Yeah. I use the idea of humility all the time. And again, that's, I think, quite difficult for many people in leadership. They don't, in a way, have the language for it to admit that, about the possibility of, first, for a start, to admit mistakes, and then even to admit before, in the middle of a crisis or something like that, that what they're doing is being made on the basis of, in the area of quite a lot of uncertainty. They feel they have to appear absolutely confident. This is absolutely the right thing to do. And that's the language they've got. And I think what they've got is an ill-founded anxiety that if they do admit any humility, nuance, that everyone will pick on them. The media will pick on them because, well, what is and I think that it's certainly my experience with good communicators, scientific communicators, That doesn't happen. That if you are a trustworthy person, you can admit some uncertainties, and you can admit, cautious, you can be cautious about your claims, and people don't accuse you. They realise that that is in fact trustworthy. But so I despair of the politicians or others who can't do it. Even if they want to do it, they seem to not have the language to do it. They haven't got the confidence to have humility.
Right. One of the other concepts you brought up, or traits you brought up around the issue of communicating uncertainty was imagination.
Oh, yes.
I'm curious to know about that. Talk to me where imagination fits into a good communicator.
Well, now this is when we're really talking about an age of uncertainty, when you have enormous unpredictability, when you can't even list the things that might happen. And to be honest, without mentioning any names, well, I will mention a name. When you've got someone like Donald Trump, then there is enormous unpredictability. You really, if you sat down and tried to list all the possible things that could happen over the next few months, you would have great difficulty doing it. Yeah. But you really should be trying. Organizations should be trying. And that's why they need imagination. They need to be able to imagine possible futures that are really not obvious. And I mentioned the fact that, for example, the UK Ministry of Defence, they employ science fiction writers. They write science fiction stories. Some of them, they're amazingly good. I think, wow, I mentioned there's one short story about a drone attack on London, which is exactly like the Ukrainians did to Russia almost, and but it had been written a few years beforehand.
So having kind of a collective of ideas of people thinking about what could happen.
Yeah, and you need a special sort of person. I'm hopeless. I've got no imagination. So you need to have a source of people who have a very diverse viewpoint, who may sometimes be quite difficult people. They may be quite pessimistic people. They may not be the sort of people you might want to work with a lot of the time, but they might be able to think of things that you haven't thought of. And so I think that if you're in an area of what is known as deep uncertainty, where you can't even list the possibilities, you need imagination.
Are you thinking about all the things that could happen with AI in your list of risks?
Well, that I think is an area of quite deep uncertainty because it's very difficult to list the possibilities. People are, making some broad statements, but I find it really difficult to judge, what will happen. Right. And so that's why there's a lot of interest now in a way, trying to be precautionary and certainly trying to establish some governance, which I think is very reasonable. So this isn't just sort of let loose. Yeah. I think my biggest anxiety is about not just AI, but algorithms. For example, recommendation algorithms on TikTok and other social media, which are, as people use their phones as their main source of information rather than the collapse of local and national newspapers, and even, my kids never watch television, for example. It all just comes from their phone. Yeah. And so I get, that makes me very anxious when I think, what are the controls over this? What is the governance over this? And, in terms of, not in terms of what people can say, I don't want to censor what anyone could say, it's the fact that it's then so easily promoted to so many people. So I think everyone's got a right to say what they want. I don't think everyone's got a right for it to be broadcast to everybody by some recommendation algorithm.
Everyone's got a megaphone now.
Yeah.
In summary, I do want to ask you, for our viewers tonight, what is it that you think the practical rule you'd like us to remember about communicating uncertainty and living in an age of uncertainty?
Oh, that's very difficult.
That is
a big question. I think I come back to this idea of actually trying to be trustworthy, of trying to realize that there's, rather than trying to manipulate people when you're trying to communicate or anything, to believe or think something, actually trying to think, how can I inform people, empower them to make better decisions, which is also a message to the media, I think, as well. And that means having some balance, not a false balance, and being open about uncertainty, but also something I emphasize all the time, trying to preempt misunderstandings. When you can say, okay, we're not, we have uncertainty, but what we do know is that the evidence does not mean this. So you try to get in there before the misinformation starts going, so fast. You try to head it off. It's very difficult, to do. So you have to think in advance. How could somebody misunderstand what I'm saying? And you try to prevent it as much as you can.
It's the ultimate empathy, isn't it?
Well, yes, exactly. I mean, this is the point about trying to be, good communication, of course, being aware of your audience, and also what I do say is that there's no point in being trustworthy if you're dull. And of course, that's what the media knows. You've got to engage people. If people are just going to turn off and not listen to you, there's no point in communicating. So you have to both be trustworthy, but also engaging. And that's the one bit, I think, where it is reasonable to try to persuade people, is trying to persuade people to engage with issues.
Yes.
And that means using all those wonderful skills that the media have got of trying to bring people in and engage them.
What a wonderful conversation this has been. Thank you so much for sharing some of your insights.
No, it's been great fun. Thank you very much.
I appreciate that. Thank you. That's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thanks so much for watching. Good night.